Did the universe have a beginning? Or has it existed from eternity past? If it did have a beginning, this raises a question. Did the universe have a creator? In part 1, we explored this question scientifically. Now let's look at it philosophically. Aristotle believed the universe was eternal in the past. But Al-Ghazali disagreed. He pointed out that if the universe did not have a beginning, then the number of past events in the history of the universe is infinite. But that's a problem, because the existence of an actually infinite number of past events leads to absurdity. It's metaphysically impossible. Why? The mathematician David Hilbert illustrates the problem by imagining a hotel with an infinite number of rooms, all of which are occupied. There's not a single vacancy. Every room in the infinite hotel is full. Now suppose a new guest shows up and asks for a room. The manager says, sure, no problem, then moves the guest who was in room number 1 to room number 2, and the guest who was in room number 2 to room number 3, and so on to infinity. As a result of this shuffling, room number 1 becomes vacant, and the new guest happily checks in, even though all the rooms were already full, and nobody has checked out. And it gets even more absurd. Suppose an infinity of new guests show up at the front desk. No problem, says the manager. Then she moves each person into a room with a number twice that of his own room. So the person who was in room number 1 moves into room number 2. The person who was in 2 moves to 4. The person who was in 3 moves to 6, and so on. Since any number multiplied by 2 is always an even number, all the odd-numbered rooms become vacant, and the infinity of new guests gratefully check in. And yet, before they arrived, all the rooms were already full. It gets even crazier when the guests start to check out. Suppose all the guests in the odd-numbered rooms check out. In that case, an infinite number of people have left the hotel. And yet, there are no fewer people in the hotel. But suppose instead, all the guests in rooms numbered 4 and above check out. In that case, only 3 people are left. And yet exactly the same number of people left the hotel this time as when all the odd-numbered guests checked out. Thus, we have a contradiction. We subtract identical quantities from identical quantities and get different answers. These absurdities show that an actually infinite number of things cannot exist in the real world. Here is a second argument Ghazali offers against a past eternal universe. Suppose that for every 1 orbit Saturn completes around the Sun, Jupiter completes 2. The longer they orbit, the further Saturn falls behind. Now, what if these 2 planets have always been orbiting the Sun from eternity past? Which has completed the most orbits? Strangely enough, the number of their orbits is exactly the same, infinity. But that seems absurd, for the longer they orbit, the greater the difference becomes. If the universe has always existed, then an infinite series of past events has been formed by adding one event after another. It's like a sequence of dominoes, falling one after another until the last domino, today, is reached. The problem is that the final domino could never fall if an infinite number of dominoes had to fall first. So today could never be reached. But obviously, here we are. It's today. So the number of events leading up to today could not possibly be infinite. The infinite is nowhere to be found in reality.
It neither exists in nature nor provides a legitimate basis for rational thought. The role that remains for the infinite to play
is solely that of an idea. What objections might be raised to these arguments? Some people object that, unlike the rooms in Hilbert's hotel, the events of the past don't all exist at the same time. But we can easily tweak the story to get rid of this objection. Suppose the hotel has been under construction from eternity past, 1 room being added each year. How many rooms would there now be in the hotel? An actual infinite number. So if the past is infinite, that would imply that Hilbert's hotel could exist, which is absurd. Others have objected that an actually infinite number of things do exist, namely numbers and other mathematical entities. However, this objection presupposes that numbers really exist, but this is a highly disputed assumption that most philosophers reject. So if Ghazali's two arguments are right, then the universe is not eternal in the past. It must have a beginning. And we know intuitively that whatever begins to exist requires a cause of its existence. Thus, we are led to conclude that the universe has a cause of its existence. So what caused the universe? Atheist Daniel Dennett says, the universe caused itself. But this is incoherent, because in order to cause itself to come into existence, the universe would have to exist before it existed. The cause of the universe must therefore be outside of the universe, spaceless, timeless, immaterial, and enormously powerful. Much like God.
Okay, so we are brought back to our argument from last week, the Kalam cosmological argument. And it states this, premise 1, whatever exists, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Premise 2, the universe began to exist, therefore, conclusion, the universe has a cause. This was our argument from last week. We're going to be looking again this evening at the soundness of the argument, or are the premises 1 and 2, are they actually true? Can we show that they're true? And therefore the conclusion would follow logically from that. We're going to be doing that again tonight, but this time through the lens of philosophy instead of science. Next slide. Philosophical evidence. Now, think about this. I had shared with you guys last week that this argument for the existence of what ultimately leads to an existence of God kind of argument really found its way into Christianity in the earliest of days. We're talking late 300s, early 400s AD. But then it was developed later on in the Middle Ages, right? We talked briefly about the history of this and why it's called the Kalam and all of that last week. Now, think about that, though. The people living in 300 AD, 400 AD, and up until the modern era, they didn't have the scientific evidence that we have today. They didn't know anything about special and general relativity. They didn't know anything about microwave background radiation, what are cosmic singularities, right, or any of this stuff that we talked about last week. They didn't have any of that. That was until the 20th century that we started having that kind of scientific picture of the universe. So they had to argue not on the basis of science, something that they could infer going backward in time like an empirical observation like that, but rather they argued philosophically. The Middle Age thinkers, the Christian thinkers, the later Muslim thinkers, they had to argue philosophically. And so we look also at philosophical evidence for reasons why the two premises must be true. All right? Now, it's interesting because we oftentimes find as scientists scale the mountains of knowledge, at the top they are greeted by the philosophers and theologians that have been standing there for thousands of years, right? And in fact, I've been reading the Confessions by St. Augustine. Augustine is one of the brightest thinkers of the Western world. In fact, a lot of what we have today in our society and the way the Western world kind of approaches knowledge and how we think, a lot of it has to do with Augustine. A lot of it stems from Augustine. He was a bishop in North Africa in the late 300s, early 400s. And he wrote this in his Confessions. You, O Lord, made that very time, and no time could pass before you made those times. But if there was no time before heaven and earth, why do they ask what you did then? There was no then. where there was no time. So Augustine had this epiphany in 400 AD, basically. He had this epiphany that without the universe, there is no time. That time and the universe are part of creation. Time doesn't stand over creation, but rather time itself is a created thing. And then it took Einstein, it took the rest of the scientific expedition 1,500 years to catch up with what Augustine had realized in 400 AD, right? So we see this oftentimes where philosophers and great theologians and thinkers of the past actually come to the same conclusions that science only later verifies. And so when we talk about philosophical evidence, we're going to talk about some of these ways that philosophical thinkers would think about, the universe and the eternity of the past and all these kinds of things. And that's what we're looking at tonight. So the first premise again, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. Last week we said it's a pretty intuitive premise. I stand by that. The relation of cause and effect is a pretty innate one to human beings. It's kind of how we think. It's how we perceive the world. It's obviously a very scientific conclusion, but let's look at this philosophically. In the 5th century BC, so about 450 years before Christ came on the scene, Parmenides said his famous, "Out of nothing, nothing comes." Out of nothing, nothing comes. Parmenides is a Greek philosopher, right? And living about 450 years before Christ. And he brought into philosophy what we now call the causal principle, which has been a cornerstone law of metaphysics for thousands of years. Metaphysics just means kind of what's beyond physics, like the undergirding principles of all of reality, right? Even beyond what's just space-time, like we've been talking about with science last week. Beyond that, what's the underlying principles of reality? And Parmenides said, hey, one of these principles is the principle of causation. Out of nothing, nothing comes. So if we see something, if something comes into being, like we've been talking about, it has to have a cause for its existence. It has to have a cause. Remember the concept that we tried to ingrain last week of what nothing is. Nothing is not empty space. That would be something. Empty space would be something. Nothing is not darkness or blackness. That's something. Nothing is not a quantum vacuum with very low level energy fluctuations, right? That's something. Nothing is no thing at all. And I mean, it's hard for us to even think of something like that. Look at that. I even, in my own language, it's not something, but I even say that, right? Just to communicate a point. It's hard for us to even conceptualize nothing. But we have to understand when we say nothing, we mean no thing at all. No thing at all. Now think about what it would mean to come from no thing at all. Right? We believe, as Christians, we believe in the doctrine of creatio ex nihilo, or creation out of nothing. You've heard that phrase, ex nihilo, like out of nothing. Right? Creation out of nothing. But what we mean by that is that when God created, He didn't create out of some pre-existing material. He created out of nothing. But there's still a cause, right? The cause is God. There's still something. The cause, namely God Himself. Okay? Think about what it would mean to truly arise out of nothing. That would be the insanity of trying to deny this first premise. Now, we have heard this objection before. We have no experience of the origin of universes. So maybe universes come into being uncaused, right? We have no experience. Like, that is something we don't have an experience of. You weren't at the beginning of the universe. You don't know how it all works. We can extrapolate back scientifically and infer certain things, blah, 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 blah. But really, we don't know. Maybe universes are the one kind of thing that comes into being without a cause. But here's why that fails. Even if you grant, yeah, you're right, I have no experience of a beginning of a universe, right? But here's why that fails. Because if we're talking about nothing, then there's nothing that could discriminate for universes. Like there's nothing that could prefer to bring universes into being versus something else. Do you see what I'm saying? Nothing. No thing at all. Why would it be universes that would, for some reason, have this magical ability to pop into being uncaused from nothing? Why would it be that when the nothing can't prefer anything? It can't prefer a universe. You see what I'm saying? So these kind of objections that someone might raise all fall flat. Ultimately, fundamentally, the negation of this first premise, that anything that begins to exist has a cause, the negation of it leads to absurdity. Because if you grant, okay, maybe universes do come into being uncaused out of nothing. Well, then you're obligated to just go, well, then anything can. Because, again, nothing can't discriminate between a pink bunny or a universe. Nothing can't discriminate between, a flying spaghetti monster or fill in the blank, a unicorn taking off like a spaceship into the sky, right? Nothing can't discriminate. It can't prefer universes over anything else. So ultimately, it would be inexplicable why things don't just pop into being all the time, uncaused out of nothing. Why we don't just see things all the time coming into being uncaused from nothing. And so most of these objections, I think, fall short. And ultimately, I think we're on safe grounds to affirm that first premise. Just like we did last week, it's an intuitive premise. It makes intuitive sense, and it follows the metaphysical laws that are the cornerstone of rationality and proper thinking. We all believe in cause and effect, right? I will open it up for questions there. That's our first premise. We're not going to deal too much with it. We'll deal more with the second premise, but I will open it up for questions there. All right, so then our second premise. Our second premise, the universe began to exist. The universe began to exist. To deal with this one philosophically, we need to lay a little bit of groundwork first. So go on to the next slide. We need to define what we mean by past eternal, or the concept of infinity itself. When we talk about infinity, we usually mean one of two things. There's a difference between a potential infinity and an actual infinity. Okay, an actual infinity is a collection of, say, things that equal the mathematical concept of infinity. We have the mathematical symbol for infinity right here, right? The infinity symbol. When we talk about an actual infinity, we're talking about a collection of things or a set of something that equals the actual mathematical concept of infinity. It actually numbers infinity literally. So you could maybe something like an infinitely deep ocean. Like the concept of an infinitely deep ocean. That would be an actual infinity of say, water molecules. There's an actually infinite number of water molecules contained in an infinitely deep ocean. Right? H2O, a water molecule. So if you began swimming into an actually infinite depth of ocean, you would swim what? Forever and ever and ever and ever and ever and ever and ever, and you would never reach the bottom. because it actually equals infinity. You could go 6 quadrillion miles deep, and you still have an infinity of depth in front of you. That's an actual infinity. That's an actual infinity, where there's an actual collection of infinite amount of, say, water molecules or something like that in this infinitely deep ocean. Now, contrast that with a potential infinity. A potential infinity, how do I define it here, is a process or sequence that is unending. So say I have, say like this, my microphone here is actually a ruler. Okay, my microphone is like a ruler, like a foot-long ruler. Now, I could divide that ruler in half, right? And then I could divide the halves in half again. And then I could divide all those in half again. And again, and again, and again. And technically, I could continue to divide that ruler. Now, eventually, I'm like going to reach a limit, aren't I, in my own ability. Okay, but just theoretically, right? Theoretically, I could divide the space that is in between the 2 points. I could divide that space over and over and over and over again an infinite amount of times, right? Okay, that though is not an actual infinity. That is a potential infinity. In other words, I might divide it 6 quadrillion times, but I still haven't divided it an infinite number of times. I could keep going, but I'll never actually reach a point where I go, I've reached infinity. Do you see what I'm saying? It doesn't matter how long I do it for or how many times I do it. It will always end up being it'll not an infinity, but a finite. It'll always end up being a finite number of times that I've divided the ruler. Even though the concept of I could potentially do it an infinite number of times. Do you see the difference between something that's actually infinite, like an infinitely deep pool or an infinitely deep ocean, versus something that there's potential for infinity, but we never reach it? You could always go one more time, right? And no matter how many times you do it, it's still always finite. That's the difference between an actual infinity and a potential infinity. Now, here's the claim we're going to make tonight. The claim is that, except as a mathematical idea, because in math, infinity is well understood, and mathematicians use the concept of infinity all the time. But except as a mathematical idea, actual infinities cannot possibly exist. That's our claim tonight. That's our claim. Now, I know you're already probably asking a few questions because I've talked about this enough with people. I've taught this enough times to know that people generally have a few questions, especially Christians, after I get to this point. So let me just preempt those, and then we'll see if you have any follow-up questions. Okay, what about everlasting life? If you're telling me that an actual infinity can't exist, well, isn't eternal life infinite? Okay. But remember how we define actual versus potential infinity. Eternal life is not an actual infinity. It is a potential infinity. In other words, at some point, you are either going to die or Jesus is going to come back and you're going to be translated in the blink of an eye, right? And you will enter an eternal state where it's like, all right, you are never to die again. You are never to die again. But here's the thing. No matter how long we exist in unending life, in eternal life, it never reaches the number infinity. We might live for, again, I'll keep using that number, 6 quadrillion years. We might live for 6 quadrillion years. But 6 quadrillion years is not infinity. Do you see what I'm saying? It is It is a potential infinity. It will never end. Eternal life, it will never end. But there will never come a point where you go, I have reached infinity. You will always just go, I'm on day 10 to the 500th power, right? 1 with 500 zeros after it, right? That's the day I'm on of eternal life. You'll never actually reach the number infinity. So eternal life is not an actual infinity. It is a potential infinity. What about God's infinite, things like his attributes, like his infinite power, his infinite knowledge? Well, this actually isn't, this is really just a linguistic thing, okay? It's just we mean two different things when we're talking like this. So when we talk about God's infinite attributes, what we mean is that God has like, say, power. He's all powerful. We mean that he has maximal power. He has power to the most degree, right? To the maximal degree. That is the kind of power God has. It's all power. He has all ability to bring things about. Okay, but that's saying nothing about like a numerical set. It has nothing to do with numbers. It has nothing to do with an amount like that, like a quantifiable, right? A real number, that's infinity. We're just using language like infinity to convey an idea that God is maximally great. He's maximally good. He's maximally powerful, right? But we're not actually saying that he has some kind of like an infinite number of good or something like that, right? So this is more just linguistic. It's not really an issue at all. It's just a linguistic issue with the language we're using to communicate that. And then lastly, this is the most difficult one to understand, but it is important. What about God's eternal existence? So we're arguing against the past eternity of the universe, right? We are arguing against that. We want to say that the universe had a beginning. We want to say that the universe came into being some time ago in the past, right? What about God? Because if God is eternal, doesn't that mean he has existed for an actually infinite amount of time? No. Because what have we been talking about when it comes to time? Time is a created thing. Time itself is part of creation. It's part of the universe. So God doesn't exist for an infinite amount of time in the past. He exists timelessly. Do you see what I'm saying? He exists timelessly, not for an infinite amount of time, but he exists without time. There is no, apart from creation, there is no progression in God at all. This is why we say he's immutable, unchanging. There's no progression in him at all. He doesn't even have one thought that succeeds another thought. Because, like, why do we have progression? Why do we progress in life? Because we're growing? Because we are trying to do good for ourselves or do good for others? We're trying to learn something? We're trying to discover and explore? Okay, God doesn't do any of that. He just is. He just is. So there's no progression in God apart from creation. And so his existence is eternal, not of infinite time. Time, think of it like a clock. Tick, 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 right? God hasn't existed for an infinite number of ticks. He has existed without the ticks. Okay? This is a core concept to understanding the eternity of God. And it'll come into play even a little bit later tonight. But what I'm trying to convey here is, Well, yes, the question was, we're proving that God existed before the universe. We will get there, yes. But the point is this. I'm claiming that it's impossible for an actually infinite number of things to exist. And I'm showing that things like eternal life for us are not actual infinities, they're potential infinities. Things like God's infinite knowledge and power, that's just a semantic difference. We're just talking about two different things. On one hand, we're talking about math. On the other hand, we're talking about the idea of all-powerful, maximal greatness, right? And God's eternal existence even is not an infinite number of ticks. His eternal existence is one without ticks. There isn't even anything to measure. Time itself is a created thing that God created. Like Augustine said, in 400 AD. And then Einstein realized 1,500 years later, right? Time itself is a created thing. God is outside of time. And so he has not existed for an infinite amount of time. He's existed timelessly. Now, I know there has to be some questions on that one. Somebody, come on. Give me some interaction here. Online or in person? Yeah. The question is, so infinity that we're talking about has to do with math and things like measurement and time. Yes, exactly. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about potential and actual infinities. And then you're saying, when it comes to God, we're talking about potential infinity, not actual infinity. In some cases, we're not talking about any kind of infinity at all. Like his eternal existence is not infinite at all. It just is without any kind of measurement. So it doesn't even constitute a potential infinity. It just is. He is eternal, right? Not existing for a long amount of time, but existing outside of time. Yep. Good question and good clarifying. Good clarity as well. Okay, so let's talk about our universe then. Let's talk about our universe. If the universe had always existed, if it itself is past eternal, different than God, and this is key, you have to understand this. When we talk about an eternal universe, that's different than God, because implicit in the concept of a universe is time, right? Time is part of the universe, space-time. And so, whereas we can talk about an eternally existing God without reference to time, we can't do that when it comes to the universe, because time is part of the universe, right? So if we think about a past eternal universe, what we would be seeing is that the universe would actually consist of an actually infinite number of past events. If the universe, which exists in time, not outside of time like God, but in time, if it was eternal in the past, then it would mean we're talking about an actual infinity of things that have happened in the past. Does that make sense? The number of events that have occurred, if the universe was eternal in the past, would be infinity. If it was eternal. But this cannot be. And this is the big clincher. This is the big point, okay? This cannot be. Because you can't create an actual infinity by addition. So think about it. Can you count from 0 to infinity? Go ahead, try it. Try it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Can you count from 0 to infinity? Can you count by adding one thing to the next thing successively? No, you can't. I'm sorry, you can count. You can't count to infinity. Yeah, that is counting. That's the definition of counting. But you can't count to infinity because you'll reach 6 quadrillion and you'll still have an infinite way to go. Okay, but see, if the universe was past eternal, and therefore the number of events in the universe was actually infinite, that means that it would be like trying to count from eternity past one at a time, one event at a time, until you reach the present. But you could never get to the present day. Do you see, Roy gets it. Roy gets it. You could never get to the present day because you'd be counting forever, and you'd still have an infinite chasm to cross before you got to today. The only way you could count to today would be to arbitrarily go, I'm going to start from here. Think about what I just said. The only way you could count to today would be if you arbitrarily went, I'm going to start at this point and then start counting. And then you have a finite number of things. You know, maybe you start 100,000 events in the past or something, and then you count to today. You could do that, but it requires a starting point. That's the whole point. That's the whole point. If the universe is past eternal, there's no way we could ever arrive at today. It'd be like an unending domino set, and the last domino is the red domino. They showed it in the video, right? The last domino is the red domino, and the dominoes just keep falling for all eternity, one after the other, infinite number of events. But no matter how far we go, we still have an infinite way to go, and we could never reach the present if the past was eternal. Eternal in time. God is eternal outside of time. Okay. How did we arrive at today if the universe is past eternal? You can't count down from infinity. We just established you can't count up to infinity. You also can't count down from infinity, though, either. And that's the point. So this is a philosophical argument. This was actually Al-Ghazali's argument. Remember, I talked about how the Kalam moved into the Muslim world after it percolated in Christianity for a little bit. It moved into the Muslim world in the later Middle Ages, and Al-Ghazali, one of the great Muslim thinkers, realized this. He goes, well, hold on. If the number of events in the universe in the past is eternal, we could never get to today. This was his idea from over 1,000 years ago. Because philosophy and theology can tend to see further than where just empirical evidence like science can get us in any generation, right? Next slide. All right, this is a fun one. This is a fun one. Hilbert's Hotel. I will try to explain this better than the 30-second blip you got on it in the video. I'll try to slow it down for us a little bit. Okay, David Hilbert was one of the greatest mathematicians of the 20th century. He was a German mathematician. And he helped, actually, the world of mathematics understand the concept of infinity a whole lot. He contributed to all kinds of different mathematics. But he created a thought experiment named after himself, Hilbert's Hotel, David Hilbert's Hotel. And it goes like this. You have a hotel that is an actual infinity. There's an actually infinite number of rooms in this hotel. And every single room is full. No vacancy, right? You have a guest that comes to the counter. And the person behind the counter, say the owner of the hotel, how can I help you? The guest said, well, I'd like to have a room, please. Infinite number of rooms. They're all full. Sure, the owner of the hotel says. I'm just going to have everyone move down one room. Unto infinity. Everyone just move down one room unto infinity. Well, now you have room for one more guest. Okay, but we'll keep going. It gets weirder. It gets weirder. How about an infinity of people come? A huge line outside, right? An infinity of guests arrive. All the rooms are full, but there's an infinity of guests outside. And they say, we all want a room. He goes, sure. And then he calls, he puts an announcement to the whole hotel. Okay, whatever room you're in, just double it and go to that room instead. So the person in room 1 goes to room 2. The person in room 2 goes to room 4. The person in room 3 goes to room 6. What's double any number? It's always even. So now you have all the odd number rooms unto infinity empty. They were full a second ago, but now they're empty because everyone just moved to the room double theirs. Okay? They're all in even rooms. So then he now can make space for the infinity of new guests that want to be part of it, right? That want to have a room. Now, here's a really crazy thing. You could do that an infinite number of times. Another infinity of guests, just do it all over again. Everyone go double your room. Okay, now you guys take the odd numbered rooms. Do it again and again. You could do it an infinite number of times. But it gets even weirder. Okay? It gets even weirder. What if everyone in the odd numbered rooms check out? Unto infinity, everyone in the odd numbered rooms check out. You just had an infinity of people leave this infinite hotel, and you still have, in the even number rooms, an infinity of people. So infinity minus infinity equals infinity. Okay? But just wait. Just wait. You're now a little flustered as the owner of the hotel because you just had a hotel bursting at the seams, but now half the rooms, all the odd number rooms are gone. And it feels a little empty. So you say to everyone, you send out another announcement, right? And you say to everyone, all right, just divide your room number by 2. So the person in room 2 goes to room 1. The person in room 4 goes to room 2. The person in room 6 goes to room 3. The person in room 8 goes to room 4. Unto infinity, and now the hotel is bursting at the seams again. Because now every room is filled. Okay, but here's the real kicker, right? Now everyone in room 4 and upward leave. How many people are left in the hotel? Yes. You're sharp, Kate. Kate said 3. Yes, there are only 3 people left in the hotel. Everyone in room 4 and upward leave. What does that mean? Okay, well, we just saw that infinity minus infinity equals what? Infinity. But now we just saw that infinity minus infinity equals 3. You get contradictory answers. It's all a contradiction. What is this showing? Okay, what is this showing? It's just showing that the idea of an actual infinity is absurd. That it cannot possibly exist in reality. There are potential infinities. There are things that are unending, potentially, that you could do forever, potentially. You'd never reach infinity, but you could keep doing forever, right? There are potential infinities, but there's no such thing as an actually infinite number of things. And so David Hilbert's famous quote, he gave a speech in 1924, I think it was, called On the Infinite. And he said this: "The infinite is nowhere to be found in reality. It neither exists in nature nor provides a legitimate basis for rational thought. The role that remains for the infinite to play is solely that of an idea." And if that's true, then there cannot possibly be an infinite number of past events in the universe. Therefore, the universe had to have a beginning. And it's through these kind of arguments that philosophers of old in Christianity and later in the Muslim tradition, philosophers of old realized that the universe couldn't be past eternal. Even though they had no scientific evidence for that, they didn't know any, like I said, anything that we talked about last week, they didn't know any of it. But they still came to the correct conclusion just by thinking deeply about the world. And they realized that the universe could not be past eternal. Questions? By the way, you can offer criticisms too. If you're like, no, I think you're wrong. Or I'm happy to entertain some objections as well. That is always fine in my classroom. In college and stuff, the teachers loved me because I argued with them all the time. I mean, honestly, most of the time in college, university, kids, you're just like, most people are just zoned out on their laptops, not paying any attention, just kind of like, whatever, and just there to get the credit. But I was the kid who would raise my hand after the teacher said anything, and I would argue with them. And they loved me for it. They absolutely loved me for it. I am the same way. If you ever want to just raise your hand and argue with me, I would love you for it. Okay. I practiced at home. That is not true. That is not true. Okay, so through pure philosophical reflection instead of scientific reflection, we come to the same conclusion. The universe began to exist, next slide, therefore, logically, the universe has a cause. This is where we came to last week. But now we want to go a step further. Now that this is part 2, we've looked at scientific and philosophical evidence to support our premises, to show the soundness of the argument. Now we want to go a step further, and we want to ask a follow-up question. What would a cause of the universe be like? What would a cause of the universe be like? Because a cause of the universe implies a number of things that are quite startling once they're fully grasped. So we're going to start basic, and we'll kind of progress. Okay? First one is this. A cause of the universe could not be a material cause. It itself could not be a material cause. A natural explanation cannot be the cause of nature itself. At the end of the video, the people who made the video quoted Daniel Dennett, who is one of the 4 horsemen of the new atheism. Daniel Dennett, Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, and who am I leaving out? Sam Harris. They were called the 4 horsemen of the new atheism. Kind of the turn of the century, the early 2000s. There were a lot of these popular level books that were written trying to say God doesn't exist, atheism this, atheism that. This was also right after 9/11, so there were a lot of arguments going around about how religion is so hurtful to everyone and to society and all this kind of stuff. Kind of the 4 heroes of that were Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, and Christopher Hitchens. Daniel Dennett says, the universe caused itself. That's his explanation. He calls it the greatest bootstrapping trick to ever be pulled off. The universe just caused itself. That's my explanation. But of course, that's ridiculous. That's illogical. It's irrational. As a Christian, I have a far more rational worldview than Daniel Dennett. If the universe were to cause itself, it would need to exist before it existed. And that is absurd, right? It couldn't be a material cause. You can't explain nature by nature itself. But let's entertain even the idea from last week. We talked about a multiverse, right? Maybe outside of our universe, there is another natural kind of existence, that inflaton field we talked about. Inflaton field that's giving rise to new universes all the time. And that's materialistic. That's natural. That's a universe in and of itself. Great. But like last week, we talked about how even if that were true, it itself would need to have come into being a finite time ago and therefore need to be caused. And so even if you keep positing new natural explanations, an inflaton field giving rise to new universes, or something like even before that, some natural explanation before that. Even if you keep going back with this, you eventually have to come to an explanation that is outside of the space-time universe itself. Therefore, the cause must be spaceless. Remember, space is not nothing. Space is something. Space is created. It's part of the physical world, this 3 dimensions we exist in. It has to be spaceless. It would have to be timeless. It brought time into being. It itself is outside of time. It would need to be immaterial because it exists outside of the material universe. It exists outside of nature. So it needs to be immaterial. And it would need to be inconceivably powerful, unimaginably powerful, beyond your ability to imagine, because it brought all matter and energy into existence. Some very interesting conclusions. What else would the cause need to be? Go on to the next slide. The cause must itself be uncaused. Okay, why? Why? Because just like we said, how an actually infinite number of things can't exist, and a past infinite number of things can't exist, you can't have an infinite regress, we call it, of causes, where it's just, that thing caused that thing caused that thing caused that thing, and it just goes back unto infinity. We just argued against the possibility of an actually infinite number of things. You can't go back infinitely into an infinite regress of causes, material or immaterial. You can't get there. Eventually, everything comes down to an uncaused cause, or what the ancients used to call the prime mover, the one who sets everything else in motion. The prime mover, the uncaused cause. Gene, you had mentioned last week, you were talking, I think, about your niece, perhaps, and you were saying an objection of, who made God, or something like that. Who made God? Eventually, you have to come to an uncaused cause. It's the only logical conclusion. It's the only rational conclusion, because there can't be an infinite amount of pre-causes. And if that's true, then we come to the cause being itself uncaused or uncreated. It never came into being. Remember the first premise: whatever comes into being needs a cause of its existence. God didn't ever come into being. He has always been. And so therefore he is uncaused. The cause must itself be uncaused. Next one. The cause must be singular. Singular. Now, why would the cause need to be singular? Who's heard the term Occam's razor? Anyone? It's used oftentimes in philosophy and scientific circles. It's also called the principle of parsimony. It's named after a theologian from the 1400s, 14th century, so 1300s, named William of Occam. And he was a theologian. He contributed a lot to our understanding of logic and all of that. And he proposed this idea that when you're coming to an explanation or a cause, you need to infer the fewest amount of entities, or causes in our case. Entities must not be multiplied beyond necessity. This is sometimes more colloquially just phrased as a simpler explanation is a better one. Let me give you an example of this in action, okay? So say I come into church 5 minutes before class, and I run to my office quick, and on my office desk, I find someone has left me a bottle of Coca-Cola, right? Okay, what would be a rational inference that I could make if I saw that? Just shout it out. Someone was in my office? Sure. Yep. Someone brought it to me. Probably, I'm assuming, one of you guys, right? Someone here maybe brought it to me so I could be drinking it while teaching or something like that. I have my water tonight. That'd be a good, rational inference. Okay, but say I was like, saw this Coca-Cola on my desk, and then I was like, I think someone brought this for me tonight. And I think they did so because there was a leprechaun that whispered into their ear that they should bring it to me. And that leprechaun told them to bring it because I know that the leprechaun empire has been out to get me. And the leprechaun empire has been trying to assassinate me for the last 10 years. And so the empire sent this deceiver to tell someone in our congregation to bring me this drink, and they must have put poison in it. And now if I drink it, I'm going to die. Okay. Okay. There's many reasons why that is an irrational inference, okay? But one of the reasons that is irrational is because I am multiplying entities beyond what is necessary. What is necessary to explain that? Somebody brought it for me, probably one of the students, so that I could be drinking it tonight. But when I start positing more causes, more entities, I'm moving from what is simple and rational to irrationality and to what is illogical, ultimately. So when we talk about a cause of the universe, due to the principles of parsimony or things like Occam's razor, we ultimately come to the conclusion that unless there's really good reason to think otherwise, which there isn't, although some would say perhaps the problem of evil would be a reason to think. You know, there's been plenty of religions and spiritualities that have tried to posit these two kind of divine beings, one good, one evil, because we see both good and evil in the world. So there's a reason that they might have to posit more than one entity or more than one cause. But when we get to the problem of evil, we'll show why that actually isn't an issue. But the point is, unless there's really good reason to think otherwise, you should assume that the cause is singular. Otherwise, you're just moving into the realm of irrationality and being complex for no good reason. Ultimately, this is, if you guys just want to know, this is why conspiracy theories are almost always irrational. It's why conspiracy theories are almost always irrational, because they assume more entities than are necessary to explain what's going on. You know, we always know that one person, right? Like Uncle Remus, who just believes all the conspiracy theories, right? And I mean, you know, in some ways it's kind of benign, but in other ways it shows a very basic dysfunction in rational thought to always think like that. It's showing that something is kind of not screwed in properly. So the cause must be singular. And the last one, the cause must be a personal agent. The cause must be personal. Or in other words, it must have will, volition, the ability to make a decision. We might say it must be a mind. Now, why would we infer that? Why would we infer that? It was said that the cause has to have knowledge of what it's going to do. Well, the trick is that it does something. So we'll get there in a second, okay? It does something. How do we get an effect with a beginning? Okay? The effect we're talking about is the universe. That's the effect. And it has a beginning. It itself is not eternal in the past, right? The effect has a beginning. How do we get an effect with a beginning from an eternal cause? Let me try to paint this picture a little bit more clearly. What is the cause of water freezing? Water freezing. What is the cause of that? Temperature being 32 degrees Fahrenheit or 0 degrees Celsius, right? Okay, the cause of water freezing is the air being 32 degrees Fahrenheit or 0 degrees Celsius, okay? That's the cause. Now, think in terms of an eternal cause. Say that the air from eternity past had always been 32 degrees or 0 degrees Celsius. The effect of water freezing would then be what? Exactly. The effect would then also be eternal. Do you see? If the cause of water freezing, 32 degrees, 0 degrees Celsius, if that had been eternal in the past, then we would experience the effect of that, water being frozen, to have also always been, to have also been eternal in the past. But we are talking about a cause that is timeless or eternal, but yet brings about an effect with a beginning. How is that possible? It's because the cause must have the ability to choose to do something. So, say I am an eternal, I have existed for eternity past, right? And I am for all eternity past, I have sat motionless, stillless, unmoving. I have sat from all eternity past. Because I am a free agent, because I have volition, I have will, I have the ability to choose something, right? I may be sitting from eternity and suddenly decide to stand up. God exists timelessly, eternally, without progression, unchanging, immutable, and suddenly, let there be light. The only thing we know of that can bring about a temporal effect from an eternal cause would be something like an immaterial, eternally existing mind. It's the only thing we know of that could do something like that. The point is, if the eternal, because remember, timelessness implies changelessness. Apart from the universe, apart from creation, sans creation, without it, God is unchanging. There's no progression in God. He's unchanging, eternal, immutable, self-existent. But if he is a free agent, he could go from unchanging and timeless to let there be light. Because he is a free agent, he could do something new. And that would not be possible in any other kind of a cause, or at least it would need to be proposed and shown. I don't think anyone has any grid for being able to do that. But no other kind of cause could actually produce a temporal effect with a beginning if itself was eternal, unchanging, except for someone with the ability to choose, with the ability to do something new, with the ability to be sitting for all eternity past and then suddenly stand up, for the ability to be timeless, immovable, unchanging, and then to say, let there be light. Only a personal agent. So what we are brought to then, what we're brought to, next slide, is that the cause of the universe must be a singular personal agent who is uncaused, timeless, spaceless, immaterial, and unimaginably powerful. I don't know what you call that, but I call that God. This is one argument among a whole lot of arguments for the existence of God. We choose to do this argument because it's actually one of the simplest arguments, if you can believe that. It's one of the simplest arguments to argue for the existence of God. But there are many. There are many. But if the kalam is sound, and if our inferences are correct, we know it's valid. But if it's sound, which is what we've argued for, that there's good evidence scientifically and philosophically that this is the way it is, if that's true, then this is basically what we have come to in a two-step argument, in a three-step argument, right? Two premises and a conclusion. That the cause of the universe is a singular personal agent who is uncaused, timeless, spaceless, immaterial, and unimaginably powerful. What does this also mean? If our argument is right, if our premises are sound, if we've made a good case, then we have already winnowed the field down to generic monotheism. We've already winnowed the field of pantheism, which says that the universe is God. That can't be true if what we've established is true. We've already winnowed the field from polytheism, all paganism, if what we've said is true. We're basically down to the great monotheistic faiths and or deism. Deism being, a God created this universe, but has not revealed himself in the universe. That's deism. Very popular in like the 1700s. Deism. But we have, in a three-step argument, and again, there's many other arguments for the existence of God, but this was the one we were going to focus on. And we're doing a couple others in this class as well. But this was the one we were going to start with, the kalam. In a three-step argument, we've basically already gotten from who knows what all the way to monotheism. Maybe panentheism if somebody's very clever and can kind of sneak in a few things here and there. Panentheism is the idea that the universe isn't God, but it is part of God. I'm actually reading a book right now from a friend of mine who I'm very worried about at the moment, who seems to be arguing for panentheism, so I'll be sending him a nice paper write-up as to why panentheism cannot possibly be true. But you guys, that's a lot of ground. And it's not, we don't put all our ducks in a three-step argument. It's not like it's either this is right or, Christianity is false or something like that. That's not it. That's not it. But I want to show you that the intuitive nature of how powerful an argument like this can be if you know how to use it. If you know how to use it well. And it doesn't require you to memorize all the facts and figures that we went over. It doesn't require you to understand every single little philosophical doodad that we talked about. But in conversation with a friend, asking questions about, what do you think about the universe? Well, what do you think about, could there really be an infinite past? Do you think that's possible? Or do you think it has to stop somewhere? Do you think there could be just one cause after the other, or do you think it has to stop somewhere? Asking friends questions like this, getting into the meat of things, and being able to have just a conversation around some of this can be an eye-opening moment for people. Truly, because most people have never even thought about this kind of stuff. Frankly, most people have never even thought about this kind of stuff. But it gives us great rational grounds to believe that God exists. Questions. The observation was made that just the first part of the cause being immaterial, having to exist outside of nature, is already pointing to God. And I would agree with you. I don't think it quite gets there, but I agree with you that that's a good start. Next week is Thanksgiving break. Okay? So you can come here if you want, but the doors will be shut and you won't be let in. All right? Next week is Thanksgiving itself, actually, a week from today. So happy Thanksgiving, everyone. We will not be meeting here. The week after, though, we will be. And we will be starting on cosmic design. So we go from the universe has a cause to now we'll be talking about the design in the universe itself, which is a really fun one. For sure. And we'll continue some of this. What ultimately we're going toward is a cumulative case for the Christian faith. So we're ending tonight on kind of a generic monotheism, and we'll more slowly and slowly move toward a more defined vision of God than to Christ himself and ultimately his resurrection. So that's kind of the direction we're heading. I hope you've been enjoying it so far. We are a third of the way through the class as of tonight. 5 weeks in, we're a third of the way. We still got a ways to go. As usual, I will just remind everyone, we would appreciate any offerings that you can give in the basket back there. People online, skywaterchurch.org/donate, and then click the drop down of the Give To, and make sure you click Apologetics class. That helps us know kind of where everything's being allocated and all that jazz. So we appreciate that. We thank you so much, and have a wonderful Thanksgiving week, everyone. Bless you.